Ich heiße Sie herzlich willkommen zu unserem diesjährigen Berlin-Forum on Korea. Ich heiße Choi Hyun-dok. Ich bin Vizedirektorin des Korea Europe Center. This year, we invited Professor YOON Young-kwan for the lecture of this evening and Dr. Norbert Baas as a discussant. Professor YOON Young-kwan is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the Seoul National University. He taught there since 1990. He served as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Republic of Korea from 2003 to 2004. Amidst current turbulent international political situation, he would be one of the best academicians to analyze the changing international constellation and to show the ways how to think peace process around Korean Peninsula in a new way. We are so grateful that he accepted our invitation. Dr. Norbert Baas was German diplomat since 1978. Especially, he was ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2006 to 2009. This evening, he would be the best dialogue partner from German side to develop an interesting discussion starting from the lecture of Professor YOON. We feel really honored that Professor YOON and Dr. Baas accepted our invitation to contribute to this event this evening. Now, Professor YOON.
Thank you very much for your very kind introduction, Dr. Choi Hyun-dok. And it is my great pleasure and honor to speak on important issues on South Korea this evening. It is my special, privilege and honor to be invited as the speaker of the Berlin Forum on Korea 2022. What I want to do this evening is to explain the challenges South Korea has been facing these days. It's a kind of turbulent time, and what kind of challenges South Korea has been facing. I would say there are three major challenges. I will explain each of them briefly. First is the war in Ukraine. The second is the rising and intensifying tension between the United States and China. And finally, North Korea's security threats. Before I begin to explain each of them, I'd like to briefly mention what I meant with the word turbulent. Turbulent word means that we are living in a world, in a new world, where a liberal international order has been significantly weakening. Liberal international order, I think, was based on such concepts like freedom, democracy, human rights, multilateralism, rules-based order, free market, something like that. And this order has been weakening since 1 or 2 decades ago. Probably 2008, the year 2008 was a critical year in the sense that there was global financial crisis originating from Wall Street, New York, spreading to all over the world. That incident was critical in two senses. First, that was not simply an economic financial incident, but it was a political incident in the sense that Chinese leaders might have thought that the time had arrived for them to come out and speak loudly and increase their political influence in the world. They might have thought that financial crisis beginning from the United States was the sign of weakening U.S. power. So their diplomacy turned toward the direction of more aggressive and more vocal in one or another ways. So that changed the mood, political mood between the United States and China since around that time. And financial crisis was also important for another reason, because after the global financial crisis in 2008, those people who suffered during the process of globalization and global economic integration in the world began to be angry more than before. And their anger and political discontents began to accumulate year by year. And finally, in 2016, there were two very critical, international incidents. One was the Brexit, and the other one is, as we all know, the election of President Donald Trump as U.S. president. So we have been experiencing very different world since around 2018, when President Donald Trump began a trade war against China. And that confrontation spread to all other areas like economic, security, military, technological field, technology, and also ideological field. And we are witnessing, intensifying tension between those two big countries, which has affected countries like South Korea very much, as I would explain. First, let me turn to the first subject, the war in Ukraine. In April 2005, President Vladimir Putin delivered a speech to parliament, and he said, if I quote, the collapse of the Soviet Empire was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. And he continued to say that as for the Russian people, it became a genuine tragedy. Tens of millions of our fellow citizens and countrymen found themselves beyond the fringes of Russian territory, unquote. I think this statement explains what was the fundamental cause of the problem in Ukraine nowadays. Putin's decision or his desire to recover the Russian sphere of influence was the cause of all these, difficulties, war in Ukraine. Because of his desire, he invaded Georgia in 2008 and Crimea in 2014 and Ukraine February this year. And I think his thinking is, in some sense, 21st century version of imperialist thinking of the 19th century. Probably he may believe that might is right, and small countries are nothing but pawns in power politics among big powers. And he decided to violate international law regarding territorial sovereignty and self-determination blatantly. As we all know, Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and Russia is supposed to be the guardian of the UN Charter and international peace. But actually, he decided to act quite differently from his role and his country's role in international community. Just 2 days before Russian attack on Ukraine, in the UN Security Council meeting, ambassador from Kenya to the United Nations, whose name was Martin Kimani, made a speech. And according to him, if I quote, "Today, across the border of every single African country, live our countrymen with whom we share deep historical, cultural, and linguistic bonds. At independence, had we chosen to pursue states on the basis of ethnic, racial, or religious homogeneity, we would still be waging bloody wars these many decades later. Instead, we agreed that we would settle for the borders that we inherited. We chose to follow the rules of the Organization of African Unity and the United Nations Charter, not because our borders satisfied us, but because we wanted something greater, forged in peace, unquote. I think this is very to the point and very persuasive criticism against President Putin's decision. Let me pass what happened after beginning war, because you may know probably better than I do. I will just explain what kind of implication we can draw from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As we all know, Korea is a relatively small country surrounded by big powers. And because of that kind of unique geopolitical location, Korea suffered tremendously in the past because big powers' competition for expanding their sphere of influence over the Korean Peninsula. For example, Sino-Japanese War in 1894, Russo-Japanese War in 1904, and Japanese colonization of the Korean Peninsula in 1910, and division of the Korean Peninsula in 1945. Again, Korean War in 1950. All these very troublesome and unhappy experience. South Korean people suffered. Korea became a scapegoat of imperialist competitions at that time. Also, Korea has become a scapegoat of North Korean invasion in 1950. That was a blatant violation of international norm of no use for the purpose of changing national territorial status quo. So this makes me to think that it is natural for the South Korean people to criticize Russian action and help the Ukrainian people. So I don't accept the so-called realist logic that explains the Ukrainian affairs by arguing that Russian action was caused by NATO's movement toward East. I don't buy that argument because that logic simply disregarded the right of self-determination of small countries to choose their own political system and their own diplomatic direction. And in this logic, the fate of small countries is nothing but a pawn or scapegoat of international power politics. If we South Koreans accept that kind of logic, it would be equivalent to approving future imperialist behavior of Korea's neighbors, big powers, to commit similar provocations against the Korean people. We cannot approve that kind of action, of course. And it would be also equivalent to approving North Korea's exercise of military force against South Korea again in the future. So I think that kind of implication is huge for all the Korean people. And I think that is my way of thinking about how to perceive what happened in Ukraine in February this year. Again, a rules-based international order is very important for Korean people because Korea, succeeded in, developing its economy from one of the poorest countries in the world in the 1950s and 60s to the number 10 economic power in the world in 2020, for example. And it also could develop their political system as a democracy. Of course, South Korean democracy is not perfect, but owing to many Korean people's struggle in the past decades, we could develop democracy in Korea. And without that kind of a rules-based international order, I wonder whether it might have been possible for Koreans to achieve those success story in some sense. Another important implication of the Ukrainian war is that President Putin, threatened the use of nuclear weapons against foreign invasion of Russian territory, of course, including the recently integrated 4 regions of Ukraine. And this has a significant implication for the Korean Peninsula security situation. First of all, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un might have thought that he and his father made the right decision to develop nuclear weapons because Ukraine was attacked by Russia blatantly, mainly because they gave up their nuclear warheads in 1994. I think as soon as he heard the news about a Russian attack, he might have thought so. Furthermore, Kim Jong-un may be closely watching what's going on in Ukraine these days. Especially, he may be carefully watching how NATO would respond to Russian nuclear threat. If NATO cannot succeed in dealing with this kind of nuclear threat in a reasonable and proper way, that will embolden North Korean leader further, and probably there may be more risk or danger would be coming to the Korean Peninsula in one way or another. And North Korea made it clear that their nuclear program aimed to deter foreign invasion. And the reason why they developed their nuclear weapons was for defensive purpose, and that was legalized in 2013. But this year, they changed that policy radically. And for the first time, North Korean authorities declared that they can use nuclear weapons preemptively in some critical situation. So in this kind of situation, how the Russian nuclear threat would be handled in this part of the world will have very significant implication for Korean Peninsula. Let me move to the second topic, the rising tension between the United States and China. As we all know, the relationship between two countries are becoming more tense and difficult day by day, especially since around 2018. U.S. President Donald Trump began a trade war in 2018. And I think 2018 was as important as the year 1972, when President Nixon visited Beijing and began his policy of engaging in China. 2018 was a critical year, and President Trump began a very different policy toward China. He gave up actually engagement plus hedging strategy, and his strategy to China has become much more confrontational. And President Biden basically inherited that policy, but he has been implementing that policy more systematically. Because of isolationist thinking of Donald Trump, President Trump couldn't mobilize international cooperation in confronting China. But President Biden emphasized the importance of alliance and international coalition, multilateralism. So he and his team has been trying hard to mobilize international support, making various kinds of international coalitions, many small-sized multilateral networks, etc., etc. Nowadays, the United States and China are competing in almost every areas, as I already explained. And this new phenomena of intensifying confrontation between the United States and China is the most important and fundamental challenge for the South Korean diplomacy, I think. Before the U.S. gave up engagement plus hedging policy toward China, there were some room for South Korea to benefit from having good relationship with both countries. South Korea depended its security on the United States for a long time as allies. And on the other hand, South Korea could benefit from interactions with China. And there were some rooms for that kind of diplomacy. But the situation nowadays is pushing South Korea to choose between those two big powers in both areas, economic as well as security. So it's a huge dilemma for South Korea. As we know, ROK-US alliance is indispensable as long as North Korea continues to be a serious security threat. And also, our relationship with China in terms of economic transactions is huge. Our trade volume with China is bigger than the sum of ROK-US trade and ROK-Japan trade. That shows how our economic relationship is deep with China. So South Korea is being pushed to a very difficult situation. And in this kind of difficult situation, the new administration of Yoon Suk-yeol shifted the foreign policy orientation toward putting more focus on international diplomacy. And he set his goal of Korea's diplomacy as pursuing global pivotal state. He put more emphasis on strengthening the alliance relationship and recovering Korea's relationship with Japan. And at the same time, he offered his own proposal to North Korea, which is basically exchanging economic assistance and denuclearization. He even offered that South Korea would be able to provide economic aid only if North Korea comes to the table. That was somewhat very generous offer to the North Korean side. But North Korea flatly declined that offer. Anyway, I think President Yoon seems to have set the direction rightly, but he also faces two significant challenges in his diplomacy. One is how to manage South Korea's relationship with China smoothly, because Chinese leaders may be somewhat unhappy to witness new conservative government in South Korea began to emphasize its traditional relationship with the United States again. So I think managing ROK-China relationship smoothly will be an important challenge for President Yoon's administration. And also how to deal with North Korean threat. And that will be another difficult challenge. North Korea is becoming bolder and bolder because they become more confident about their nuclear power these days. It's a big dilemma. I think South Korean diplomacy in this turbulent time should be based on some considerations. First, the issue of life or death is more important than the issue of how South Korean people live well materially or not. That seems to be clear in my mind. In other words, as long as the security threat from North Korea is imminent and serious, it's a reasonable policy for South Korea to put higher priority on its alliance relationship with the United States. And the second point I'd like to make is South Korea needs to join in as many multilateral networks of the West as possible and expand and strengthen its bilateral relationship with other like-minded countries in the world. That will help South Korea boost supply chain resilience. And South Korea, as we know, is a small country with not much natural resources. Also, it will help to strengthen the technological capabilities of South Korean businesses in the future. So that is why I'm in favor of South Korea's joining Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and Chip4 Alliance. I think one of the important like-minded countries for Korea is Germany. Both countries are allies of the United States and share common values. And both countries want to make a significant contribution in terms of providing international public goods. And there may be some industrial fields in which both countries can cooperate. For example, South Korea is strong in IT industries, while Germany is strong in machinery industries. I mean, of course, Germany is strong in almost every manufacturing sector. So there will be enough room for mutual cooperation. Another point I'd like to make is South Korea needs to diversify its economic relations with other foreign countries. If your country depends heavily on one specific country, that country will feel temptation to utilize that kind of heavy economic dependence of your country on that country for political purpose, especially at this kind of typical turbulent period. So you need to be careful, and it is much better for you to diversify your own country's economic transactions. And that's why I have been emphasizing the importance of deepening relations, with some countries like India, ASEAN countries, and European countries too. Another point I'd like to make is democracy is important for Korean people. They don't talk much about democracy nowadays. They just take it for granted. It's like an oxygen. They don't think it is important until that began to disappear. So South Korean government needs to be careful so that government's foreign policy choice does not hinder the operation of democratic system in South Korea. I think that should be considered when our leaders think about foreign policy directions of South Korea these days. Finally, let me turn to North Korean security threat. You might have heard many things about North Korea's recent military provocations. It launched missiles 38 times this year only. They say that they are doing that because of joint military exercise between the United States and ROK. Actually, there was no military exercise during the last 4 years. Since 2018, when President Donald Trump decided to stop military exercise because it was expensive, if I borrow his term, there was no military exercise. And actually, North Korea utilized that precious 4 years for advancing their military technology for missile development and nuclear development. And nowadays, their missile system is very sophisticated and powerful. For example, they launched KN-23, short-range ballistic missile. It flies very low, at very low altitude, and it flies very fast. And it is very difficult to detect that missile and hit that missile because it flies so low and so fast. And the goal of this missile would be preemptively destroy all the important military bases in South Korea, both U.S. and as well as South Korean bases, at the very early stage of beginning of war. So it's very threatening and dangerous. There are many other technological developments. So it is natural for leaders of both countries to resume major-scale military exercise. Kim Jong-un, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, might have decided to respond very strongly and in a very provocative way. And that's what we witnessed these days. I'm much concerned about this kind of tension because sometimes wars break out, not just because top leader decides to destroy the other side, but because the situation got out of control because of misperception or misunderstanding or overreaction. There are many cases like this in the history of international wars. And I'm afraid that kind of situation. So when I visited Washington, D.C., I used to talk about that. And I recommended the U.S., I hope the U.S. Government send a high-level envoy, special envoy to North Korea. But the problem is the Biden administration is tied to so many other imminent issues, and they don't seem to have political capital to invest on this North Korean issue nowadays. So it's a kind of difficult situation. And on the other hand, South Koreans feel very insecure these days, mainly because they witnessed the kind of provocations by North Koreans. And nowadays they are discussing what South Koreans should do. Should South Koreans develop its own nuclear weapons, or should they reintroduce tactical nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula? They are discussing nowadays those matters. In my personal view, those two options are not appropriate because it has many difficulties. For example, when President Park Chung-hee wanted to develop South Korea's own nuclear weapons in the mid-1970s, the U.S. responded very strongly, and finally President Park gave up. I think the situation has not changed much since that time. The United States strongly oppose, that option, South Korea's own development of nuclear weapons. Reintroducing tactical nuclear weapons, that has also problems because the base, you need to keep those tactical nuclear weapons in certain bases. Then that base becomes easy target for attack of North Koreans or some other powers. So U.S. Strategic thinkers always argue that it is better to deter North Koreans by utilizing something like submarines or air fighter planes with nuclear weapons. So, that has some problem. I think the only thing at this stage we South Koreans can do would be continue to strengthen extended deterrence of the U.S. In one way or another. I think that seems to be the only option left for the time being. Okay, let me stop here. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Well, Professor Yoon, congratulations on that very interesting speech and very comprehensive and touching on all relevant aspects of today's security situation. I have nothing really to object, but I would love to raise some of the questions you posed and you asked. And the whole setting of international relations, of course, was described very well by your statement on the declining force of liberalism, which gives a very, perhaps even one day burning background to issues like political acceptance of our societies, political backing for democracies. And the risk is certainly that the neoliberal, so to say, countries which have accepted this world of freedoms according to the end of history, Fukuyama, could get in a situation in which people do no longer share these values and then raise the issue of democracy. Why democracy? If the poorer get always poorer, if the richer get always richer. And that may then give rise to a lot of, discontent and also risks from undemocratic forces. So against this background, I think you or what you said has an additional moment of attention, which will make the situation even more difficult if one of the things you mentioned gets out of hand, if people suddenly realize that they're on the losing side when they are part of a democracy. But let's hope that will not happen. When you spoke about turbulence, I think it is important to note that at least here in Germany, we still have not a very good base of knowledge about Asia. Unfortunately, I have to say, we have developed a more ambitious agenda, as Mrs. Lee said. That is true. We have this new idea of an Indo-Pacific, and I agree that certainly that gives our relationship, Germany and Republic of Korea, a potential new agenda, or at least some of the issues in that context based on a value alliance or on a value partnership can be seen in a new way. And this is indeed something I think it would be good to focus on in the future. And you also said that, so I couldn't agree more. And in the Korea Forum, we already discussed some of the issues. I personally would very much welcome if Germany and the Republic of Korea could do much more, could start in working together on development cooperation and raise some of the issues in the Pacific, which are key for the future, survival of many of these island states. And it would be not that ambitious that other states would have sleepless nights. On the contrary, but it would be something of a peaceful touch, and it would at the same time make us learn to work together on things like sinking islands and climate change and all these things. So we definitely, this would be my view and my contribution to your thoughts about this enlarged room of maneuver, you mentioned that word, I think, is that we have to entail more personnel into that. We have to make our ministries work on that, if I may say so. And they should sit down and conduct consultations on what they do. And it would be interesting, but I think that should be left to the experts, also to include Australia or one of the other states of the Pacific, which is also a value partner. So that was very interesting. Indeed, what you said is very valuable. Then now you said a lot about Russia, which is, as you may know, also my personal long diplomatic service value. And I've worked in Moscow and in Georgia, and I was a special envoy for relations with Russia, etc., etc. And you put that all so well that I do not have to add much. First of all, I think that we are now debating on the situation in Russia. I mean, Putin is really fighting against his back at the wall, the back at the wall, we say in German. Very few people in Germany had believed that it would come to such a development. At the beginning of the war, almost everyone here said, it will take the Russians just 4 weeks, and then Ukraine will be flat and they'll give up. And suddenly we realized this enormous engagement of the Ukrainians and this enormous force by motivation and by their own nationhood, which is put in doubt continuously by Putin. But to see this force of this fighting spirit and this motivation against, I put it bluntly, against the evil, against torture, against attack with... Today I heard at the radio that the Russian defense minister himself was talking about 100,000 possible Russian victims of the Russian army, of the Russian armed forces. 100,000, I couldn't believe it. But it is a disaster. So where will that lead to? It will lead probably to a very lasting demoralization of Russian forces, not only military, but also political, cultural. People will be desperate if they wake up and ask themselves, in what country do we live? And whether Putin whether Putin can survive that is more than doubtful, in my view. So difficult times ahead with Russia, and a very important moment also to see very critically the assistance, which was apparently North Korea has offered long-range artillery to the Russians. And there was, according to American sources, that it left North Korea not in very big dimensions, but sufficiently important. So if North Korea becomes now an ally of Russia, or has already become, that would sharpen the confrontation, of course. And that is just one comment I have on that. the question of whether NATO, with the very noticeable Korean participation at the last summit, can really do something to confront Russia is a very difficult one. I mean, our policy has always been, let's keep NATO out, because then we would immediately be in a war with Russia, and we cannot afford that, and we cannot steer it here from Europe. And also the Americans don't want it. So there's a consensus not to exaggerate the conflict with Russia. And there are continuous rumors that already some of the people here are believing that we should perhaps open up discrete channels again to talk to Russia. But this is a very hot issue. But it will come up sooner or later. On the other hand, I think the Germans must have an interest not to end up with a wrecked Russia, everything in shambles and demoralized and economically disastrous. We cannot save Russia, and we cannot want it. So also, it's not about Ukraine, but it's also about the future of Russia. And again, an endless story. And I think that here also Korea should show a more vital interest. You showed it, and we have heard that at the Korean Forum recently, also very substantive contributions. But I think it should become a part of South Korea's foreign policy basics that the Ukraine issue is not far away, but it immediately may confront Korean interest through North Korea, through the loosening of the conviction that proliferation is necessary, etc. So here I would also like to very much confirm what you said and give it an additional incentive to bring that home, that it's not far away for you. The weapons Kim sends there come from your country or from Iran, and geography is not so important, but the political background is very important. Now, China, US. Well, it's interesting to see that not only is South Korea China's largest trading partner, but also Germany from the European Union. It's gigantic, so we both have the same the same partner at hand. And I believe that what you said is all very correct. I have not very much to add. The only thing is I always believe that Korea should not, as you did in even 3 instances, always depict itself as such a small thing between the big powers. You are not. You are the 10th largest economy in the world. You have weight. You are a member of the G20, and everybody knows your products. And you are a highly militarized country with a huge armed forces. So why do you always say you are so small? You have more military force than Japan, much more. And of course you know that, but you don't play it out. Your humility is part of your education and your national identity, and it's quite clever to do that. But we should know among ourselves that you're not that weak as you like to depict that here.
Yeah, thank you very much for your compliment. Yeah, I mean, that comment is very meaningful in the sense that I always feel in Korea that while South Korea's capability, economic capability, military capability, or national power has grown so quickly and to the advanced countries level, the mindset of ordinary Korean people after experiencing those tragic, historical experiences of war, division, and sufferings, they are still slow in adjusting to the new status of South Korea, and they are slow in narrowing the gap between the reality of South Korea's position in the world and their kind of psychology. Yeah. There's a huge gap. Yeah. But I think nowadays it's narrowing in one way or another, especially young people don't feel any kind of, complex or, because they have never experienced those, bad times. Yes. And they are proud. And they are very, cosmopolitan in one way or another, and reasonable, open-minded. So I think that gap will be narrowing down.
Well, I hope. And I would like to see more initiatives by the government of Korea also on global issues. And again, I think here we can find a common ground with the EU and Germany. Well, that's basically all I wanted to say, but I can only add that, of course, from my perspective, it's solely a decision, of course, of the Republic of Korea, but now jumping towards the idea of having nuclear weapons, it would not be very wise. I think it would show that you want to pay back with the same kinds of threats, and so the others have. So in a way, it's in that case, I think it's better to show restraint and modesty, and not to try that. Yeah. Try it with other ways and means, with your mind and with your.
That's right.
Efficiency and with all the things you have in your country, but not with nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I think I fully agree with your point. And after all, I mean, number one foreign policy of Biden administration and other U.S. administrations too was non-proliferation.
Yeah.
And number one priority.
Yes. Exactly.
And if U.S. ally, South Korea decides not to respect that kind of number one priority foreign policy goal of U.S., that will hurt a bilateral relationship in some significant ways. I always, think that South Koreans don't have to panic. Instead, they need to think carefully and calculate what is the cost and benefit of this option or that option or something like that.
Yes.
At this stage, at the current stage, I think the U.S. can manage the nuclear threat coming from North Korea. They may be thinking in their minds that they do not speak out, but I guess top leaders of U.S. government may be thinking that, Korean guys, we, the United States, could contain Soviet Union, which had tens of dozens times more nuclear warhead than North Korea. So let's suppose North Korea has 20, 60, 100. What's the problem? We can handle that. And even Soviet Union collapsed, in the competition with the United States in 1991. And about 28,000 American soldiers are staying in South Korea. What other proof or what other evidence can be more strong that U.S. would defend you?
Yes,
exactly. That kind of thinking may be there. So South Koreans need to understand that, and nuclear option in that regard has more cost than the benefit from South Korean perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You pointed out the issue of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is very, as we all know, that began to be influential since the early 1980s, and globalization has deepened since around that time, especially after the 1990s when the socialist camp collapsed. And there was an interesting phenomenon. Since around 1980s, top 10% rich people in the United States, income has increased rapidly from something like 30% to 45% in 2020. Something like that, which means that income distribution became more and more unequal, and that may contribute to the economic polarization and political polarization too. Of course, there are many other issues which contributed to political polarization of the United States. So I think it has kind of, some problem, and the U.S. government, I think, should have cared better those people who suffered, who lost their jobs because of increasing imports, manufacturing imports from China, for example. Those people who lived in Rust Belt areas. Those people helped President Trump come to the politics and become president. So it has very, close relationship between all this neoliberal trend deepening in the 1990s and 2000s. And whenever I thought about that, I always envied German social market economic system. Of course, social market economy of Germany, I heard, influenced by this trend of globalization significantly. So there may be some differences between what I think and the reality of German economy. But anyway, I think a social market economy system of West Germany since the end of World War II probably, was the best, reasonable economic system rather than a neoliberal, economic system like in the United States and UK or some other countries. So that's one reason, just only one reason that among many reasons that I like German.
Thank you. Well, I agree. It's probably one of the best systems in the world, but we have our problems because we are too slow and too complicated. We're all too slow and everything. But I would be very interested in how you assess the recent judgment by Kevin Rudd, who wrote an interesting article in Foreign Affairs saying that what really drives China now is ideology. I discussed that with our main expert on China, former ambassador there, Volker Stanzel, who was working at the Foundation of Science and Policy, Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. And he said, you can always turn it like that, but what really drives Xi Jinping is not Marxism and his ideas, it's his power. And he uses Marxism in order to reinforce his power. So it's a more instrumentalized rather than an original, authentic force into his intellect. And, I don't know this gentleman, but in spite of it, I think it is important to see that, taking some quotations from a recent article I read, that in all spheres, Xi Jinping has said, Marxism should win, and it should be also a worldwide winner. So, and he distributes that in his famous readings or whatever you have. And if such a new ideology, a new version of Marxism became successful, one has to be very careful also to not to end up in a defensive position on democracy and the market economy. So I think that indeed the more or less social democratic oriented system in Germany has good chances to win the battle of minds if we came into such a situation. So far here, I think nobody can take that really seriously, that people believe Marxism. Do you really believe Xi Jinping believes in Marxism? But if you go through his readings, it's a very, very strong issue.
So some people nowadays saying that President Xi Jinping is becoming more like Kim Jong-un of North Korea. So it's kind of very ironic. For the leader of such a huge country which has very important influence in world affairs to be too much ideological in his thinking and in his policy is very regrettable because it will have serious impacts on world affairs, impacts on the U.S.-China relations, and impacts on what will be going on in Northeast Asia. I think 2009, 10, 11, I think those years was important. I heard, in those years, there were big debates among top policymaking circle inside China again on which direction China should go. One camp argued that as Chinese economy grows, China's political system should be flexibly adjusted toward the more open system. And the other group argued that that was exactly why the Soviet Union collapsed. So China should go to the direction emphasizing the importance of ideology more and strictly control people. And unfortunately, I think Xi Jinping belonged to the latter group, and he implemented that kind of philosophy since 2012. And it is very unfortunate because if that kind of direction affected U.S.-China relations negatively, and some people don't like to use a new Cold War in describing U.S.-China relations. But the fact that those two countries began to confront in terms of ideology make the current relationship between two countries a kind of new Cold War.
Yeah.
Because if you fight the other side in terms of ideology, you tend to believe the other side is evil. And there is no much room for some kind of practical or pragmatic thinking intervene in that kind of bad relationship. So that may lead to much more confrontational and serious confrontation. And that's exactly why I am more or less skeptical about the relationship between those two big powers, especially when I saw the list of the top 6 Politburo Standing Committee members a few weeks ago. I was very surprised. All those 6 people were, President Xi Jinping's men. And the fact that there was nobody who can check, President Xi Jinping is dangerous. The reason why President Putin made miscalculation when he decided Ukraine was because of authoritarian system. There was simply nobody who can speak the truth to the top leader so that he can judge in the right direction. And I think President Xi Jinping may become similar to Putin because of that kind of system which lacks check and balance system in top decision making. So I'm concerned about that too.
Is there a role Europe can play? With our experience of a Cold War, we have something to offer in terms of intellectual input, but I have my doubts. So I should wait for your answer. But could you advise us on raising our voice in favor of good ideas for the world?
I think China has been very good in dividing and rule. Yeah. For example, if I think about ASEAN, I really hope ASEAN could be a kind of independent, somewhat autonomous body of international grouping. But the current, the reality is very different. For some members of ASEAN, especially those countries located in the continent, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, all these countries are very pro-China. And there are some other countries that are not. And in that way, ASEAN was, divided. They cannot raise their own voice in one way or another. And that's kind of regrettable. And I hope Europe can take some kind of constructive role in one way or another. But I think that should be the goal after united Europe to fight authoritarian forces like Russia first, and then after some kind of stability in the world situation arrives, I think there will be much more room for Europe to take that kind of constructive role.
Well, if you ask me personally, also from my experience in Moscow 4 years and then later in the Russian experience, in spite of Putin, I think that the Russians are not as totalitarian-minded as the Chinese now. Because if you look at the control systems the Chinese implemented with observing everyone in the street at every time from morning to night. Some say the next step will be that also the public toilets will be supervised. So this system is absolutely unique in the world, and I think in Russia that would not be possible, because the Russians may hate totalitarianism, but they adapt. So they obey and they react against. So this is a combination in their use of power and in their societies, which is quite common. But total obedience is not really a Russian characteristic, I would say.
Yeah.
Because there's a rest of sympathy I have for the Russians. You realize that. Because also now, I mean, look at the protests in Russia. I mean, in spite of controls, in spite of very, very heavy punishment, people go to the streets and they do express their discontent with Putin. In China, I cannot imagine that is going to happen. So we have probably here two totalitarian states, but with different traditions.
I think so.
And with different social habits.
Yeah, sure.
So,
I have a question
Sure.
to both of you. So if the international or the global liberal order has eroded, and especially 9/11 after that, what order are we living in today? How would you characterize it?
I hope not, but I'm afraid we are living in a transition period toward a very difficult time like 1930s. In 1930s, there was a huge, wave of populism, and extreme dictators appeared here and there, and there was a kind of Begodai naval economic policies. And there were, three major economic blocks, competing against each other. There was no major international leadership. And all these things are so similar nowadays. So I'm closely watching what will happen in the United States. For example, midterm election and next presidential election, because the results of those elections will be very critical, because in some sense, Biden is the president who eagerly wants to avoid the world falling, that way, becoming similar to the 1930s. And if he loses power in the American politics, probably there will be no more hope. I'm sorry for being pessimistic, but that seems to be the
more
case.
pessimistic than I am.
I was wondering what your thoughts were on internet war, or more like the digital war that is also increasingly taking place and playing a strategic important role in warfare, and how are Germany and Korea maybe cooperating developing better security infrastructure?
I think that's an excellent idea. Actually, I talked briefly about how to handle intensifying North Korean security threat. And as I mentioned, that South Koreans now are much worried about the current security situation of South Korea. And I also said that probably strengthening extended deterrence would be important. And how to strengthen extended deterrence by the United States? I think one area is internet, for example, and cyber and information intelligence was in that area. For example, North Korea is hacking many financial institutions, for example, and still huge amounts of money. We need to solve that kind of problem, because international community has been applying economic sanction against North Korea. But if North Korea continues to be able to steal money through internet or hacking or something like that, then there would be no use, no effect of sanctions. So I think it is important in that regard. And I hope there would be some chances for mutual cooperation between Germany and South Korea.
We can learn a lot from you. Digitalization in Germany is a difficult issue. I mean, it's progressing far too slowly, and too many blockings and hindrances and old-fashioned thinking, and it's much more difficult than in Korea.
Yeah, I thought Baas made the point that the Republic of Korea is now a major global military power. You're starting to engage in arms exports in a rather big way. Success to you. But don't you think that the North Korean nuclear program is an indication of weakness, not strength? I mean, your annual budget increases in your military are 50% of what the North Koreans spend in total on their military program. So here you have a weak country, North Korea, reacting to a very strong, powerful military counterforce in the south. I mean, unless you understand that point, you're never going to get the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons. Their view is very much that from that perspective. They are being threatened, not you.
Yeah.
Just add something that
Yeah, sure.
Jim said. I have talked to the North Koreans, by the way, today. There is one thing, your cruise missiles you mentioned, with very low flying. This is the answer to the F-35, the American super plane. And the North Koreans are very afraid of this plane. And the only what they do is a reaction. And he's completely right. And if you saw, like I saw, North Korean tanks, well, this is a rolling museum, what you see. Yeah. But it's not the high tank, the P2 you have, with a German motor, a German gun, and German ammunition. Therefore, it's easy to condemn North Korea, but it's more difficult to know North Korea. And what we are doing is very easy to condemn them, but to see that this country, also the ammunition, is many things they do is a reaction of what we do.
Yeah, I mean, both of you raised very important and relevant point. And let me explain my view in this way. I fully agree that in the beginning stage of North Korea's nuclear weapons, they decided to develop, they thought they are very weak. Around that time, I think the right policy should be to engage them and open diplomatic relations and provide economic aid in one way or another and make them to become a normal member of international community in return for strongly asking and prohibiting any kind of nuclear program. Actually, we had that kind of opportunities in the past. For example, I really regret we missed the opportunity. That was in 2001. That period began 2001. President Clinton basically, adopted engagement policy, and as we all know, in the year 2000. They began to exchange high-level officials between the two countries, and they also considered normalization of political relations. And also, when the high-level military officer, I forgot his name, when he visited Washington, D.C., both countries made a communique in which they promised to end hostile relationship between two countries. And after President George W. Bush inaugurated 180-degree reversal of the policy, and North Koreans were very confused at that time. I still remember that some of my friends who talked with high-level North Korean officials, and my friends told me that they were very eager to know what was the real intention of George W. Bush administration. And they couldn't believe that U.S. policy can be shifted that much. And they couldn't believe that. But anyway, at that time, we missed, because if probably Al Gore was elected as the president, he might have continued engaging on policy, and U.S. and North Korea relations become probably, there may be diplomatic opening. And I think the U.S. and South Korea and other Western countries may open diplomatic relations with North Korea, providing some economic assistance and helping them to become a normal state, and strongly control any desire of developing nuclear weapons. I think that might have been possible around that time. But unfortunately, President Bush's policy was never in favor of that direction. So we missed the opportunity. And in my personal view, actually, I was foreign minister, when President George W. Bush and his team, like Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld, exercising huge influence in decision-making toward North Korea, I really had a very, very difficult period at that time, trying to persuade them to begin dialogue with North Korea, because if you begin dialogue with North Korea will continue to develop their nuclear weapons and missile technologies, which will lead the weakening negotiation position of our side, means U.S. side and South Korean side. But they would never listen until around 2006, when North Korea finally tested their first nuclear weapons. So I really, regret that. We missed the opportunity. And once they decided to become a nuclear state, I think no more their goal is defensive. No more they think they are weak. From that time on, their goal became offensive in some sense, and they may be trying to utilize their newly acquired nuclear power to drive a wedge between South Korea and the United States, weaken alliance relationship, and make pressure U.S. to withdraw American troops from South Korea, which is very aggressive. So I think their goal has changed, depending on time situation or something like that.
Sorry, may I?
Yeah, sure.
Say something. It's because of nuclear weapons. Of course, the North Koreans had one. I think it was when Kang Sok-ju was still in power. They had the feeling that the Americans could easily lead a local nuclear war on the Korean Peninsula without having to be afraid that the nuclear war could jump to the United States. So the idea of North Korea was to have to stop the Americans to even think of this local nuclear war. President Clinton also was thinking before he made this new policy of nuking North Korea. And the North Koreans thought that their independence would be protected in the days they could reach Los Angeles and other cities, and stop the Americans from even thinking to start a local nuclear war on the Korean Peninsula. And this is the idea also followed by people who came after Kang Sok-ju, Ri Su-yong, to have this possibility that there will be a local nuclear war with American weapons on Korea, or even in the whole area. Yeah. This is their guarantee, the lifeline to protect them from a nuclear attack.
Yeah, I think that was right, especially sometime in the early 2000s. When U.S. government began Iraq War. And at that time, I think North Korean leaders were very afraid of possible attack against North Korea. So that was very, difficult time. And that was the moment, I think, when North Korean leader decided to become a nuclear state truly. So it's kind of, missed opportunity, I think.
But when we look at the past, our contemporary history, we have seen many military conflicts or even actual war. And then, for example, the missile crisis in Cuba, war in Afghanistan and Georgia, and Iraqi war. And even some of war the U.S. was directly involved. But I think South Korea could survive actually under this dangerous situation. And then even South Korea could develop its significant economic development, and as you said, South Korea promoted the process of democratization. And then you also mentioned the confrontation relations between the US and China. Of course, the world actually had the real Cold War for 4 decades. And then again, South Korea actually even could gain some benefit from those situations. And then thirdly, situation is very tense on the Korean Peninsula because North Korea is continuously firing missiles. But when we look at in 2017, North Korea conducted the nuclear test, and then and then Trump actually planned surgical strike. But you said the situation is even more dangerous for transitional period of time. But you think now we are living in a very dangerous situation. Why you see this situation is so dangerous compared to the when it comes to security environment?
I think the current situation is probably as dangerous as the 1994. Probably 1994 period was even more dangerous than these days. Also, 2017 was dangerous. And it is difficult, to compare which crisis was more dangerous or something like that, because there are so many variables. For example, North Korean, and the level of North Korean military technology is one factor, which contribute the degree of the extent of crisis situation. And U.S. policymaker, which political leader is, working in the U.S. as well as in South Korea, and all those issues are working as a factor which contribute the degree of crisis situation. So it's a little difficult to compare all those three, crisis situation. But I think that definitely the current situation is as important as the other two crises. As risky as the other situation, mainly because there is no communication channel between two Koreas, between the United States and North Korea. If you don't have communication, the risk of unintended military confrontation caused by misconception is much greater. So that's why I thought, the current situation is dangerous. Yes.
My question goes back to the national security issue, but I think, my question is rather about the priority that South Korea has at the moment, because there are many different issues going on, including, not only the North Korean issue, like security crisis, but also at the same time the aftermath and the investigation after the Itaewon disaster or accident, and also the global inflation crisis, which caused a lot of economic problems and financial problems for households in South Korea. So among these different issues, I would like to ask Professor Yoon, which emphasis can South Korean government or Lee Sung-yeol administration can put for the North Korean security crisis? And at the same time, I would like to ask Dr. Baas, which lessons could South Korea drive from Germany, which experienced this war and the inflation crisis at the same time is still going on after the breakout of Russian invasion of Ukraine in February.
I wonder whether I understood correctly your question, but my recommendation for the Korean political leaders, progressive as well as conservative leaders, is that please stop quarreling on trivial domestic political issues, on some gossips. I mean, every time when I watch TV, probably 80 or 90% of coverage would be on some certain politicians, gossips or scandals or something like that. And I think it's not the time for South Korean political leaders to be involved in that kind of, quarreling or debating or something like that, because the external situation is so serious. And they need to gather together and discuss what kind of strategy there should be in terms of North Korea and in terms of our diplomacy between China and the United States, and how to make contribution in terms of providing international public goods, because our government set the goal of South Korea becoming global pivotal state, and how to expand our diplomatic perspective and diplomatic space by deepening our relationship with other countries. And there are so many urgent and important issues, but they are all, in my view, are being neglected by the political leaders. So it's unfortunate, but and sometimes their debate seem to be so much ideologically oriented. For example, I am the left, so I'm in favor of South Korea going to this direction. I'm conservative. Our diplomacy with China or Japan should be this way or that way. I think that's not a correct way of thinking about calculating the cost and benefit of various options of diplomacy for Koreans. It's not time to be influenced by preset ideological orientation. I think we need to be very cold and pragmatic and careful in calculating, cost and benefit of each diplomatic options very carefully. Yeah.
As far, just a comment from my side, I cannot add very much to that, but we are sort of in a position after German unification that there was a widespread belief in Germany and also widespread talk that now sort of the golden era would commence, in which we were only surrounded by friends. This was always a talk about that. And year after year, by past, the European Union turned out to be much more difficult than we had thought, but most of the Germans didn't find themselves very well in this discussion because it's a complicated one. And at the end of the day, the biggest misperception in which the Germans were embedded was Russia, because we believed Russia is a long-term friend and everything is fine and Germans and Russians like each other. So this was the biggest disappointment at all. And then also the French turned out to be a difficult partner. And the Germans were not always very forthcoming to the French. So we ended up in a very different world today than we believed we could start in 1991 after German unification. Here we are back to the real world of diplomacy. And I see also much more challenges for German diplomacy now. We should really prepare ourselves very, very thoroughly with our closest partners for the future. And it's not that easy. So this is our experience. We came from heaven and now we are sailing towards, not to hell, but to more difficult winds, stormy weather somehow.
I agree with you. And in my view, one characteristic of the new period is this kind of transition to a different world seems to be caused by the failure of one common belief. That was if you deepen economic transaction and interdependent relationship with the other party, the other party will become similar to yours. I mean, in terms of thinking and political system or the way of behaving or something like that.
Yeah,
that belief was, turned out to have failed in all of the world. For example, U.S. engagement policy towards China failed. And in this part of the world, European engagement German engagement policy of Russia, turned out to be, disappointing. South Korea's policy of engagement toward North Korea turned out to be very disappointing also. So all over the world, we are facing the same phenomenon of failure of this kind of liberal belief that, economic interaction would improve the world in this way or that way. It is really, interesting, but we are living in a strange new world, I think.
Yeah, I was interested in the point that if you trade with someone, you become like them. I would argue that Washington's learned more from Beijing about how it should act than the other way around. But the real point I wanted to make is to say there's no communication. There's no communication because we've chosen not to communicate. The North Koreans are not speaking to the South Koreans. They're not speaking to the United States. They've made 3 attempts, to my knowledge. They've started dialogue with the European Union, and the European Union's refused.
Thank you very much. I'm probably still researching about reconciliation. And my question was, we heard that South Korea is now a global military power, similar to Japan, who officially doesn't have a military right now. But South Korea is also a big soft power nowadays. And my question is, the tension between China and that area, might it be a way for South Korea and Japan to finally reconcile each other, the long history they have? Might that be a chance, like it was for Germany, the Cold War, to reconcile with each side after the Second World War, to really run other chances?
I actually hope that, trilateral cooperation mechanism, which has been existing among those 3 countries, Japan, China, South Korea, would be working effectively. But in the last 10 or some years, it couldn't work that much effectively because of historical confrontation against each other on the historical issues or territorial issues or something like that. I tend to be somewhat pessimistic regarding the possibility because the situation nowadays is even worse than even more difficult than 4 years ago, 10 years ago, or something like that. Nowadays, there are more people who think that South Korea and China should unite with each other against, China. And that's the kind of dominant thinking these days in Japan as well as in South Korea, rather than trying to reconcile with other countries in a kind of positive way. So again, we seem to be living in a somewhat pessimistic world. Sorry to end my comment in that pessimistic note, but
no, thank you. I think it was a wonderful discussion. And again, I believe that there are many similar points in our thinking and our foreign policy issues we can share. And it was very interesting.
Thank you very much for being with us.